Good morning. I am Maggie Calkins, and I am a member of the board, and I welcome you to East Shore Unitarian Universalist Church in Kirtland, Ohio, if you are here in person or if you are watching us live or later this week. We'd like to extend a special welcome to any newcomers who are with us today. May there be peace within. May you trust that you are exactly where you are meant to be. May you not forget the infinite possibilities that are born in yourself and in others. May you use the gifts that you have received and pass on the love that has been given to you. Let this knowledge settle in your bones and allow your soul the freedom to sing, dance, praise, and love. It is there for each and every one of us.
Good morning, friends. My name is Rina Shere, Reverend Rina Shere, and I'm one of the 4 ministers that have been serving this congregation throughout this year. This morning, I will be sharing the theology, the art, the music of Hildegard von Bingen. She was a 12th century Christian mystic, and she really had a lot to say about how we can live our lives today. And we begin this morning kind of thinking about what it means to be alive. So I want to share one of her sacred readings with you. Now remember, Hildegard von Bingen was writing and preaching in the 1100s, so the language is a little different, and she was Christian. And for her, the idea of the Holy Spirit was really the life that is the life in all things. So open your hearts and minds for worship and hear these words of Hildegard von Bingen. Life giving life, all movement, root of all being, purifier of all purity, absolver of all faults, balm of all wounds, radiant life, worthy of all praise. The Holy Spirit resurrects and awakens everything that is. And now I invite you to rise as you are willing or able, but to join us in our opening hymn, singing the Living Tradition number 328. That's your gray hymnal. I sought the wood in summer.
Like fingers
Love is the spirit of this congregation, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. For our Time for All Ages today, we're going to do something a little interactive. And as you walked in, most of you probably received a sensory packet. If you did not, you will need it. So if there's anyone that doesn't have one, raise your hand, and we will make sure they are passed around. Yes, there's a cardboard box. Thank you. So just raise your hand if you don't have a sensory packet, and you will get one. Wonderful. Thank you very much. All right. So one of the reasons why you have these packets is because today we are talking about a woman, Hildegard von Bingen, who really experienced the world with all of her five senses. So Hildegard was born in 1098. She was the 10th child of a somewhat wealthy, noble family living in the Rhineland in Germany. At age 8, she was tithed to the church, which was not an unusual situation in those days. And she, at age 8, she left her home and she went to the monastery of St. Disibod. And she was put under the care of another holy woman named Jutta von Sponheim. And at age 14, she actually enters into an anchorage. So an anchorage is a very small dwelling that was built. It was attached to a monastery. And when you took a vow to be an anchorite, that meant that you were really leaving the world, that you were going to spend the rest of your life in prayer and contemplation in really a cell. I mean, it would not have been very big. I'm trying to think of maybe from in front of me to the back. It would have been a very small area. So Jutta and Hildegard actually attended their own death ceremony. They had the last rites performed over them, and then they were walled up in this cell. Now there was a window, so they could receive food and water, and they could remove the waste from their cell. They would have been able to hear all of the services that were going on in the monastery. They would have been allowed to meet with a priest for confession. But it was really just the two of them in this cell, and it was meant to be for the rest of their lives. And so Hildegard, at a very young age, is really reliant on what she can sense in terms of her environment, which is fairly stilted. But she writes later on how her visions and her theology and how she was able to be in this cell for so many years had to do with really examining the world through all five senses. In a way, almost trying to enlarge her ability to use her five senses to continue this existence. And so I'm going to lead you, myself and Joyce are going to be, Joyce is helping me, we will be leading you through the five senses. And so we're going to start with the sense of sight. And so I invite you to simply focus on one object. Maybe it is the texture of the seat cushion. Maybe it is the wood grain of the table. You could also pull out one of Hildegard's beautiful illuminations, the cosmic egg, which is a part of your order of service. It's a 4-color. But we're just going to take a moment and really focus on our sense of sight. Just quietly looking at something. And now I invite you to pull out the feather that is in your sensory packet. And for those of you who are following along at home, you can easily follow along without some of the props that we're using. The next sense is our sense of touch. And I want you to simply explore this feather and the sense of touch. And imagine Hildegard in this anchorite cell for 30 years. And the only human touch she would have had is if she were sick and Yuta would have, had to help her. Feathers would have been very common. In that time, they would have used goose feathers for their bedding. Just imagine your sense of touch. Sound would have been glorious to Hildegard. She becomes a brilliant composer of music, which was unheard of for a woman to become a composer of music. She was a wonderful singer. She sang high soprano. Many of her music compositions have a very high soprano voice leading them. And again, it would not have been common at all for someone to write music for female voices, but she wrote female voices for the nuns that were to be in her charge in her later years. And Joyce is going to play a musical selection, Rising Green, that we will be singing later. Music was a very important part of Hildegard. Hildegard's life. The anchorage was attached to a Benedictine monastery, and so Benedictines pray and sing 8 times a day, and so she would have been singing the Psalms every week. And so I think the sense of hearing was such an important sense for Hildegard in her life. Now I invite you to pull out something alive and green in your packet. I want to thank Mary Bender. She helped with these packets. You might have rosemary or lemon balm or mint in your packet. We're moving on to the sense of smell. And you might want to crush the herb. Really notice where you can smell it the most. So herbs, again, would have been absolutely a daily part of living for Hildegard. Every monastery would have had an herb garden for them, for their medicines, to be used in the infirmary. In one of the books I read researching her, it is believed that there was potentially a small patio of their anchorite, and she would have had some pots of herbs. So she would have had a little sunlight, and it is believed that she grew her own herbs. And later in the sermon, I'll talk more about some of the books she wrote about healing sicknesses with herbs. And the smells in that time period would have been very strong. And so, of course, people used herbs and sachets to help mask unpleasant odors. And lastly, we move to our sense of taste. You have a hard candy in your packet. Now, Hildegard would not have had peppermint or Jolly Ranchers, but we wanted to include something that had to do with taste. And the herbs have not been washed, so we didn't want you to eat the herbs. But Hildegard's diet would have been a lot of whole grains, eggs, cheese. She would have had a fairly healthy diet, but sparse. And so I invite you just for a minute just to be present to the sense of taste. And if you don't want the candy, you can continue to smell the herb and imagine what that herb, the flavoring of that herb, might taste like in your mouth. So I thank you for entering into this time for all ages to begin to get a glimpse of the life and the world of someone whose life was vastly different than ours. And we will re-engage with Hildegard later on this morning. Time in our service for our joys and cares. And Richard Bond, Dan Bond's brother, died last Sunday evening. Richard lived a life doing what suited him best. Most of his professional life was spent guiding tours throughout the USA, and particularly in Yellowstone and Glacier National Parks. He found his higher power decades ago, and he lived faithfully thereafter. He wanted no memorial service, but rather asked us all to turn to a friend and share a happy memory. And there will certainly be time in coffee hour for that. So we honor that life well lived, Richard Bond. Delos Datar, my dad, died on May 18th, 2022. A memorial service is being planned to be held in Westminster Oaks in Tallahassee, Florida. A plaque will be placed in the family plot in Wheaton, Illinois. He lived well for 102 years and helped start the Unitarian Church in Columbia, South Carolina, and in Tallahassee, Florida. He was a supporter of the music program. Many very happy memories. A joy. Kellen Ray graduated from Madison High School yesterday. Son of Tim and Leslie Ray, sister of Becca, and grandson of Barbara Opie. Someone wants us to know there is a Jif peanut butter recall for salmonella. So if you have Jif peanut butter at home, don't eat it. Nathan Johnson is graduating as valedictorian from South High Willoughby tomorrow. Linda Johnson, proud grandmother. Congratulations to all the graduates this year. I would also like us to have our hearts opened with compassion for the Black and brown-bodied people who are experiencing the massacre and violence in Buffalo as personal trauma. I lift up anger at the systemic racism that continues to fuel this blindness and this violence, this blindness against the basic humanity of every human being. We lift up solidarity for the autonomy of everyone to choose what will or will not happen to their bodies. And I lift up the memory of Dr. George Tiller. He was an abortion provider in Wichita, Kansas for 34 years, and he was shot and killed on a Sunday morning in May in 2009 as he was serving as a greeter at his church, the Reformation Lutheran Church in Wichita. And so for many churches across the country, Sundays in May are often lifted up to a memory of the work of Dr. George Tiller. And now I invite you to enter into a moment of silence as we are present to the many joys and sorrows of this world. And now we invite you to participate as you choose in taking a stone from the bowl in the back and bringing it up to join in the stones that are here on this table right here.
that sustains all. I awake to life in everything. In every waft of air, the air is life, greening and blossoming. The water flows with life. The sun is lit with life. The moon, when waning, is again rekindled by the sun, waxing with life once more. The stars shine, radiating with life light. All creation is gifted with the ecstasy of God's light.
Those were the words of Hildegard von Bingen. And you can see the influence of her longing for connection with life and light and nature, because for her, the Holy Spirit imbued everything around her with this magical oneness. So this service, we are lifting up in this service today a Roman Catholic saint and doctor of the Church. I think that Hildegard von Bingen is only the third woman who is recognized as a saint and doctor of the Church by Roman Catholics. And I'm just curious, how many people here may have grown up Roman Catholic? There are a few, okay. So I encourage you to stay present, even if you may have some church wounds, because I'm really going to be talking about a very joyful theology and healing of Hildegard von Bingen. And I want to share a little bit about how she's also deeply influenced my chaplaincy work and my personal spirituality. I would even go so far as to say I have a bit of a girl crush on her, because a word that is used a lot to describe Hildegard is polymath, because she was a writer, she was a poet, she was a theologian, she was a healer, she had visions, she had these beautiful, I have brought 2 books for people to look at in coffee hour in the back. She had these beautiful visions that she dictated to her nuns in a scriptatorium. So these beautiful, what she called illuminations. She was a prolific letter writer. In her 60s and 70s, she got on a horse or walked all over central Germany preaching and teaching. Again, something unheard of for a woman of that time to be doing. She was a businesswoman. Once she was released from the anchorage when Jutta died, and when the abbot finally let her be sprung from the cell, she founded not only one but two monasteries of her own, where women flocked to learn and grow with this woman. She's the only theologian that I've ever encountered who uses this profound use of the senses and the arts. So through her writing, through her music compositions and singing, and through the visual arts, she's built this beautiful three-dimensional, very layered theology of creation, and she always includes the feminine as a very important part of her theology. Hildegard is about balance, so there's always male and female energy. And back in that time, it was very binary, but I think today we could see it as very, very fluid, that there's all of these different identities that can be included in this idea of how do we live in the beauty of creation, and not only how do we live, but how do we thrive? What does creation give us that allows us to truly, truly thrive? Hildegard also lived in a very difficult time. Her lifespan is from 1098 to, I think, like 1075. So she lived during both the First and the Second Crusades, which is a very bloody time. She lived during the plague. She lived during weather catastrophes. So she lived through a time very similar to our own as well. And having spent 30 years in an anchorite cell, she certainly could understand the isolation that many of us have felt in this time of COVID. And again, she really fought to, once Yuda died, she really fought to get out of this anchorite cell. And she really wanted to be able to do more and to give more in her life. And she had visions that helped her become released. And it's reported, she reports that in many, many writings by herself and by historians, she had her first vision at age 3, and she continued to have these visions. And they were always accompanied with this brilliant light. And so this radiant light is a big part of Hildegard's theology. Now, much can be said about visions. Where do visions come from? Why do some people have them? Why do some not? As you know, I work on an inpatient psychiatric unit. So every day I meet people who are in delusional states, who have audio or visual hallucinations. And it is not my job to judge. It is my job to understand, what does this vision, what does this state of being mean to them? How might it be helpful to them? How might it be filling a need? So when we talk about the idea of visions, I'm very open to them as a different state of reality. We know that Hildegard suffered from migraines, and so some people think that some of her visions may have come from simply how the brain reacts to pain with migraines. We know that she composed music that was very, very complicated and needed a lot of breath support. We know that people can enter alternate states of mind with deep breath work, like holotropic breathing. So we don't know where her visions came from, but we know that she believed they were visions from God, and that the people around her believed they were visions from God. At age 41, the voice that has always accompanied her vision says, "Hildegard, you must write a book." So at age 41, while she's still in the anchorage, she begins writing her very first book called Scivias, or that's Latin for Know the Ways. And she dictated it to her longtime companion, a monk named Volmar. And so she begins to dictate this book. And she's filled with self-doubt about whether she really should be doing this. But through her connections and Volmar's connections, they get a manuscript, the first half of the book, they get a manuscript to the Pope. And the Pope reads this and gives it a great review and tells her to keep going. So here's this woman 900 years ago, when women hardly ever read or wrote, but the Pope is giving her a book review on her first book. And so she keeps writing, and she finally gets out of this anchorage. And she begins to realize that there's this thread that really is beginning to run through all of her work, whether it's written work, whether it is her music, whether it is even in some of her illuminations. She has this idea, and it's summed up in a Latin word called viriditas, which means greening, to green, to become alive. And the opposite of that word would be ariditas, which means dry, barren, hard of heart. And Hildegard, and the worst for Hildegard would be this in-between place, this lukewarm place of passivity or cynicism, which she knew could lead to depression. And so everything that Hildegard is teaching and writing and singing about is this idea of viriditas, or greening. She wants people, she's a woman of passion, and she wants people to figure out what in their lives. And for her, it was definitely, what has the Holy Spirit given you? But for us, as Unitarian Universalists, who understand this interconnectedness of the universe, what is it that the universe is allowing to be in your life that allows you to green and thrive? And I want you to think back just this week. What in your life allow you to feel this sense of veritas. Just think for a moment. And if you want, you can call it out so that those of us can hear it. What allowed you to green this past week?
Walking my dogs.
Our pets and being out in nature. What else?
Sunshine and warmth.
Say that again.
Sunshine and warmth.
Sunshine and warmth. Finally, yes.
Cats sitting in open windows.
Yes. Yes.
New leaves on the trees.
New leaves on trees. That's the quintessential greening. Maybe also for the choir or for Joyce it was music, playing music, singing music, listening to music, maybe for a lot of us. I know for me, gardening is a big sense of greening, literally, but also creativity. Hildegard was known as kind of the unofficial saint of creativity. And so in all of her work, she's asking this question: how can we continue to green and to thrive? And in a way, she's really pushing boundaries in this way as well, because in the medieval time, nature could be seen as a place of potential sinfulness because it was wild and it couldn't necessarily be contained as you could contain someone's life or rhythm behind cloister walls. And so she finds this idea of greening, and she takes it into her whole idea of healing as well. Now, remember, she was Benedictine, and one of the rules of Saint Benedict is that care should be taken for the sick before and above all else. And as I mentioned earlier, every monastery would have had an herb garden, and that was their medicine. In addition to growing herbs, they would have had, if it weren't honestly for the Catholic monasteries, we wouldn't have all of the science from, the first 10, 12 centuries of our time. And this included medicine and journals and writing from Egypt, from the Middle East. These were all kept safe in monasteries. So they were really the doctors and nurses of our time. And so she writes, one of the books she writes is called Causes and Cures. And in this book, Hildegard is really showing us how she is a scientist. She's writing down recipes, compositions for healing. So she's using her herbs, she's empirically writing down, I'm using, vinegar and lavender for this wound. I'm using yarrow for burns. And she's stating how many times she uses it, what results she gets. And she's handing all of this knowledge down. There's a clinic right now in Germany that is still running. It's based on Hildegard's natural teachings. Medicine right now, finally Western medicine is becoming much more open and understanding to holistic health. And there's this wonderful doctor, Dr. Victoria Sweet. You will find her cookie recipe in your order of service. This is based on a recipe from Hildegard von Bingen. Now, Dr. Victoria Sweet is a physician, but she became so interested in Hildegard that she wrote an award-winning master's thesis on Hildegard's writings on medicine and science. And then she also wrote a PhD. So she has an MD, and then she goes back to school, and she gets further degrees in medical history. And she helps explain to us working in medicine and in hospitals right now that our modern Western medicine looks at human beings as machines, a body as a machine, and when it's broken, it needs to be fixed. Hildegard, from her study and knowledge of plants and her understanding of this holistic theology of life, is saying human beings are like plants. help fix ourselves. We have so much of what we need in ourselves, and when we look at the environment that we live in, we can tell what do we need to bring in to help us, what do we need to get away from us to help us. So she's this wonderful healer in science. And when I'm working with patients, I have been able to take this idea of greening in my spiritual care, and Hildegard was very big on simply observing the patient in front of her, observing their environment. And I've gotten to the point where I give the veterans that I work with prescriptions for nature. I explain, I'm not a medical doctor, but I'm kind of your spiritual doctor, and one of the things that is so important is for you to get outside in nature, to understand the healing power of our creation. You know, we have this fancy word now called nature deficit disorder, and it's because we're not outside enough. And I'm working with veterans who sometimes are afraid to leave their room because of their severe post-traumatic stress. And so we slowly begin to work on plans to be able to sit outside on their porch steps. Then every day, take a walk to the corner. And so we're not only helping heal them spiritually, but we're allowing them to bring in greening, what is going to help them. While we're also slowly changing the neuroplasticity of their brains to begin to have new pathways that aren't as fear-based. And so I have just found that there is so much for me to learn and grow from Hildegard, and this idea that beauty and curiosity are the antidote to depression is a lesson that Hildegard also gives us through her wonderful music. And I really encourage you, when you get home today, to Google Hildegard and to listen to some of her beautiful arrangements. Many of you may be familiar with her music. For many of us, music was the portal that first introduced us to Hildegard. It was for me. And then I realized that she was this wonderful artist as well. And then I began to understand her ideas as a scientist and how her creation theology was so multifaceted. And so we learned so many powerful lessons from Hildegard. She refused to accept boundaries that society had placed on her. She refused to accept the boundaries of an anchorage. Her most fruitful years were between the ages when she was 41 and 81 when she died. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm well past 41, and so this for me can be very energizing to think that this was a woman who continued to be green and preach and teach about being green until she died. And she lived a life, she was sick on and off her whole life, and she lived a life of doubting, but yet she persisted in this belief and understanding of the beauty of the world, the beauty of the spiritual world, and how that can promote our own inner healing. And I just want to close with one of her brief writings. And this is from her book, Causes and Cures. Humanity, take a good look at yourself. Inside you've got heaven and earth and all of creation. You're a world, everything is hidden in you. This is very Eastern. It's something that you might expect the Dalai Lama or maybe Thich Nhat Hanh to have said. But this idea of ourselves as living beings infused with the holiness of all of creation is something that I have found personally meaningful, and I wanted to offer it to you today. And I just want to leave you with this idea of, as you are embarking on a new journey as a congregation, not just individually, but as a congregation, just to think about what hopes you have for greening in the future as you move into another era with Reverend Joe.
Freely have we received of gifts that minister to our needs of body and spirit. Gladly we bring to our church and its wide concerns a portion of this bounty. Let there be an offering.
We thank you for your presence here, online, at home, wherever you are. We thank you for the gifts that you share with each other every day. And we thank you for the gifts that you have shared with us today. And as a member of the board, we promise to use them thoughtfully and for good.
Please join us, rise and sing our closing hymn. Number 1068, Rising Green.
join hands in Unitarian Universalist fellowship, pledging ourselves to an individual religious freedom which transcends